I don't believe in change. I never have. And I still don't. The hallway was the same hallway it had been for 6 days. Same fluorescent lights. The one that flickered every 40 seconds, I had counted. Same linoleum. Same smell. Antiseptic. And something underneath it that antiseptic was never strong enough to cover. I was sitting in the same chair I had been sitting in since Tuesday. Nothing was happening. That was the problem. Behind the glass, 12 feet from where I sat, something small was fighting. I won't describe it. Not because I lack the words. Words were the first weapon I ever learned to use. But there are things that happen in the world that words were not built to carry. Things too fragile for sentences. So I'll only tell you this. It was small. It had been fighting longer than anything that small should have to fight. 20 men with entire alphabets after their names had stood where I was standing. 20. And every single one of them had produced the same expression. The expression that says, I have done everything I know how to do. Then they left. My name is Silas Moran. I have been called many things. The Stone Architect. The last voice in a room full of last voices. By people who didn't know my name but knew my work. Simply the reason. For 20 years, I ruled the Syndicate with the cold logic of a man who understood that every person has a price and every problem has a solution, provided you apply enough force to the right pressure point. I had never been called helpless until midnight on a Thursday in November, standing in a hospital corridor with my hands flat against cold glass, with nothing on the other side of it but a boy too small to know he was dying. His name was Marco, my sister Elena's son, born 3 weeks early, 6 pounds and 1 ounce, fighting an infection that had no name yet on any chart in the building. Elena was alive. They told me this in the careful, modulated tones of people who understood. I would interpret alive as a promise. She was alive the way a candle is alive in a draft. The corridor held its breath. My guards held theirs. And Marco, behind the glass, held his imperfectly, laboriously, with the persistence of something that does not yet know it has the option to stop. I had paid for 20 specialists. I had said yes to every number presented without negotiating, something I had never done in my life. I had waited for the number that mattered, the one that meant Marco's infection had a name and the name had a solution. That number had not come. What had come 20 times was an expression. I am not a man who prays. The capacity for it was removed from me so long ago, I am not certain it was ever fully installed. But I stood at that glass at midnight and did something I have no better word for than asking. Not to anything in particular, just the wordless asking that happens when language runs out. I did not know, then, that something had already shifted. I did not know that 30 feet down the corridor, at a nursing station I had walked past a dozen times without seeing, a woman in second-hand scrubs had been writing in a spiral notebook for the last 3 hours. 20 of the finest medical minds money could buy had failed Marco. What none of them knew was that the answer had been in that hospital the entire time, mopping the floors. 6 weeks earlier, she had been laughing. I want to hold that detail carefully, the way you hold something you didn't know you were holding for the last time. Elena was sitting in the large chair by the window in my study, the one no one else sat in. She had claimed it years ago without asking, the way Elena claimed things, not through force, but through the calm certainty that she was allowed to. She was 6 weeks from her due date. She called me Cy. She was the only person alive who did. You're going to be terrible at this, she said. At what? Being an uncle. You're going to stand in doorways looking severe, and he's going to think you're a lamp. I did not dignify that. Then her voice changed. Not dramatically. Elena never did anything dramatically. That was my register, not hers. If anything ever goes wrong, she said, you protect him, not with money, not with guns. Like a person, Cy. You protect him like a person, like you used to be. Nothing is going to go wrong, I said. Promise me anyway. I promised her. I said the words with the ease of a man who believes his will is sufficient to prevent the things he refuses to allow. She nodded, and the laugh came back to the edges of her mouth, and we talked about other things until the light changed. I had thought, leaving that room, it was the easiest promise I had ever made. Standing outside the ICU window at midnight, it felt like the cruelest thing she had ever asked of him. They came in a particular order, I understood, in retrospect, as escalating desperation dressed as escalating expertise. The first 3 were already on staff, competent, experienced. They reviewed Marco's charts and adjusted 2 medications and returned 18 hours later with the expression, and left. The 4th was a pediatric infectious disease specialist who spent 4 hours with Marco's results, ordered tests so comprehensive that additional lab staff had to be brought in to run them, returned the following morning, and produced the expression with such clinical efficiency that I almost admired it. She left. The 5th through 9th arrived as a cluster, a consulting group from 3 different cities, conferred in the hallway in the muttering register of people triangulating toward a conclusion they hadn't reached yet. They ordered the same tests as the 4th, left behind a document of recommendations the attending physician described as thorough in the tone people use when they mean useless. Victor stood behind me through all of it. He was a man constructed entirely for forward motion, for action, leverage, resolution. Hospitals didn't suit him. He moved through them the way large machinery moves through narrow spaces, technically functional, structurally wrong. On the 2nd day, he leaned down. You've been sitting in this hospital for 3 days. People are talking, Silas. The Kovaks are reading this as an opening. I did not respond. The nursing staff rotated in 12-hour shifts. I learned their patterns without trying. Different faces, different gaits, different ways of moving through the bay. One of them did not rotate. Mid-30s. Scrubs washed enough times that the color had made its peace with impermanence. No credentials on her badge beyond her name and certification. She moved through Marco's bay without the performance of expertise. No clipboard holding, no meaningful pausing. She simply worked, adjusted small things, the angle of a line, something about the way Marco lay that she corrected with a gentleness so practiced it had become automatic. She was there the 2nd night, the 3rd. She had a personal spiral-bound notebook she wrote in during the quieter intervals, the small, deliberate handwriting of someone thinking rather than recording. 20 doctors had walked past that same bassinet. Not one of them had noticed what Rosa Delgado had noticed on her very first shift. And she hadn't told anyone yet, because nobody had ever asked her. If you've ever felt invisible while holding the answer, hit like. This story is for you. On the 4th day, I did what I have always done when the world refuses to move in the direction I require. I applied more force. I made 13 calls in 2 hours, to 13 people in 13 positions of leverage. I transferred funds without negotiating amounts. A government official 4 years in my debt fast-tracked a compassionate use approval for an experimental protocol from a research hospital in Zurich. The approval took 6 hours. Normally, 6 months. The distance between those 2 timelines is simply applied pressure in the right place. The treatment arrived on a courier flight the next morning. Marco's body rejected it within 4 hours. The government approval also unlocked a specialist, the foremost authority in experimental pediatric immunology in the Northern Hemisphere. I was told by 2 separate sources. He reviewed everything with the thoroughness of a man who charges enough that thoroughness is the minimum expected return. He presented a new treatment architecture with the quiet authority of a verdict. It failed within a day. He left. He produced the expression. He left. I loosened my tie. It was a small thing. I know it was a small thing. But I had worn a tie with deliberate precision for 20 years, as armor as much as clothing. The loosening of it felt like something shifting in a load-bearing wall, a small movement that reveals how much tension had been held in that one point. Victor called 4 times. I watched the phone register each call and did not answer. I moved my chair 3 feet closer to the ICU window, close enough to reach the glass if I needed to. Through the window, Rosa was adjusting Marco's positioning, the small, precise correction she made at the start of every shift that none of the other nurses replicated. A junior nurse appeared beside her and said something I couldn't hear. Rosa answered without looking up. The junior nurse nodded with the expression of someone who has received an answer that explains nothing and everything simultaneously. Silas had purchased solutions to every problem he'd ever faced. But Marco wasn't a problem. Marco was a person, and no one had remembered to treat him like one. He found me at the window and said quietly, "Walk with me." He took me to the alcove near the fire exit, far enough from my guards for privacy, close enough to the exit to feel, subliminally, like a conversation with a door open behind it. Victor understood architecture the way I'd taught him. Every space is an argument. He spoke precisely. The Kovak family had moved on 2 eastern distribution points. 3 lieutenants had requested meetings with rival leadership, exploratory conversations, which in our language meant defections with extra steps. My absence was being read not as a family emergency, but as a vacuum. Nature doesn't tolerate vacuums. You need to be visible. 1 appearance, 2 hours. Let the situation in the east resolve itself naturally. He did not explain what naturally meant. He didn't need to. I had spent 20 years in a world where naturally meant without documentation, without witnesses, without anyone having to admit what happened. Victor was not entirely wrong about the threat. The Kovaks were real. The vacuum was real. But I stood in the silence after he finished and felt a sentence arriving from somewhere I hadn't expected. I've spent 20 years building something that falls apart the moment I stop feeding it blood, I said. What exactly am I protecting, Victor? He had no answer. I watched him not have it, the precise machinery of his thinking encountering a question it wasn't built to process. He filed it away, in the place where he kept things that were dangerous. Then his eyes drifted to the ICU window, to Marco's machines. And there was something in the way he looked at them, something calculating, that I categorized incorrectly in the moment. I was wrong about what he was calculating. Victor left the hospital that night with a plan Silas knew nothing about, because Victor had decided that if Silas wouldn't save the Syndicate, he would. And the price of that salvation was a baby who hadn't yet learned to breathe properly on his own. At 3 a.m, the hospital became a different kind of place. The performance of the daytime hospital, the hierarchy, the rounds, the deliberate theater of expertise, deployed in full view of those who paid for it. All of that retreated. What remained was the actual work. The unglamorous, continuous work of keeping people alive through the hours when the world wasn't watching. Rosa had always preferred the night shift. She was alone in Marco's bay. She opened her notebook to the beginning, not to review what she already knew, but because she had learned, through years of solving problems in the margins of other people's confidence, that the answer was visible in the sequence if you read it correctly. What the notebook contained was 6 days of observations, medication administration times, vital sign fluctuations cross-referenced against those times, the specific sequence in which Marco's medications were given relative to each other and to his body's measurable responses. The picture that emerged was not dramatic. That was the thing she kept returning to with exhausted wonder. The answer wasn't hidden in obscure medical literature. was in the timing. 2 medications. Every specialist had evaluated them independently and found each individually appropriate. Not one of them had remained present long enough to observe what happened in the specific window after both were administered together. They suppressed Marco's immune response in combination, subtly, persistently, creating a sustained vulnerability that allowed the original infection to regenerate at precisely the rate the treatments were eliminating it. The treatments weren't failing. They were succeeding and being immediately undone. They had each seen a chapter. Rosa had read the whole book. She had grown up 8 blocks from this hospital, in an apartment her mother kept immaculate, despite working 12-hour days cleaning other people's houses. Her mother believed, with the specific, undefeatable conviction of someone who has never been given a reason to believe it, that if Rosa worked hard enough, the world would eventually see what she was worth. Rosa had worked hard. She'd been good, genuinely, measurably good, in ways her supervisors noted and then failed to translate into advancement. She had applied for specialist certification programs 3 times. 3 times she had been passed over for candidates with the right connections, the right institutions. Not because they were better. They were simply more legible to the system. She understood exactly what speaking would cost her. She had watched it happen to others. Nurses who flagged concerns and were quietly reassigned, whose schedules were restructured until they resigned. She had been warned twice by hospital administration that pursuing findings outside her scope of practice could cost her license. She closed the notebook. She looked at Marco. She looked at the door. Then she did something that had cost other people their careers. She decided the truth mattered more than her safety. When did you last trust someone the world overlooked? And were you, right? Tell us below. I heard the bay door open at 5 in the morning. Not footsteps. The corridor absorbed footsteps. But I had memorized the sound of that door over 6 days, and this was different. The sound of a door opened with intention, held, then released by someone who had made a decision and was now executing it. She was walking toward me, not the nursing station, not the supply alcove. Toward me, directly, with the specific straightness of someone who has resolved their internal argument and is no longer available to have it again. My guards moved. Rosa did not stop. She looked at the guard who stepped into her path the way you look at weather. Acknowledged, noted, not relevant. She stepped around him with the patience of someone who has been stepping around obstacles her entire life and stopped finding them surprising. She sat down across from me, placed the notebook on the table between us. "I need 10 minutes, she said. "After that you can do. After that, whatever you want with what I've told you." Her voice was even, not the performed evenness of someone managing fear. I know that sound. I have produced it in people thousands of times. This was different. This was the evenness of someone who had burned through the fear on the walk across the corridor, and what remained was simply the task. "Talk," I said. She walked me through it the way someone gives directions to a place they know well, practically, sequentially, without ornamentation. The pattern, the timing, the 2 medications, what each did independently, what they did together in Marco's specific body weight and metabolic profile, in the administration sequence established by the 3rd specialist and inherited by everyone after him, because it carried the authority of its origin, regardless of its effect. She told me reversing one medication and introducing a specific alternative could begin clearing Marco's system within 48 hours. I was still. "Why has none of the specialists found this?" She did not flinch. "Because they each saw part of him," she said. "I've seen all of him, every shift, for 6 days." I called my medical liaison immediately, told him to verify her credentials, review her nursing history, and have her findings assessed by an independent party within the hour. I was precise. I did not editorialize. "Marco may not have the time your process requires," Rosa said. "I'm aware." She left the notebook on the table and returned to her bay. I looked at that notebook for a long time. I have built everything I have built on one skill: reading people accurately under high-stakes conditions, distinguishing someone performing honesty from someone in possession of it. I had been deceived twice in 20 years. I remembered both with the clarity of a man who made a discipline of not repeating his mistakes. Sitting across from Rosa Delgado at 5 in the morning, I felt something I almost didn't recognize anymore. I believed her. Deister moved while I was occupied. He contacted the lead specialist, a man who had accepted Syndicate funding in the past, and quietly pressured him to convene the team and formally dismiss Rosa's findings before they could be implemented. The specialist did this loudly, in the corridor, in front of staff. He used the phrase outside her scope of practice. He used the word documented, in the way people use words designed to function as walls rather than communication. Rosa stood through it without breaking. Victor then came to me with a sophisticated argument. Implementing an unverified protocol from a nurse with no specialist credentials could constitute malpractice, and the resulting liability could bring regulatory scrutiny to the hospital arrangements the Syndicate depended on. He framed protecting the Syndicate as protecting Marco. Every element of it was technically true. It was also constructed with the precise architecture of an argument designed not to reach a conclusion but to prevent one, to fill the space where a decision needed to be made with enough plausible complexity that the decision became impossible to execute cleanly. I walked to the window. Marco's monitor showed what it had been showing for hours. The slow movement of numbers in the wrong direction, each change small enough to call fluctuation. The cumulative picture clear enough that a word no one had said aloud yet was becoming impossible to keep unspoken. I had heard the phrase comfort care once in the last 24 hours. A junior resident, in a conversation I wasn't meant to catch. He had stopped speaking when he registered my presence. He had not met my eyes. I stood at the window and understood something that arrived not as insight, but as recognition. I had built systems that rewarded the connected and punished the honest. I had built rooms where credentials inherited authority, regardless of whether the authority was earned. I had built structures where the most dangerous thing a person could do was be right in a way that made the wrong people uncomfortable. I had built all of this deliberately, and I had never once stood on the outside of one. Victor had made a logical argument. Silas had spent 20 years making logical arguments. He knew exactly what they were for, protecting the powerful from the consequences of being wrong. I left my guards in the corridor. This was deliberate. I had not walked into a room unaccompanied in 11 years. The guards were not merely protection. They were a statement about every room I entered. I left them because I did not want to make that statement. Not in this room. Not for this. The specialist team was mid-discussion when I opened the door. The discussion stopped with the abruptness of sound, cut by a switch. I walked to the head of the table. I did not sit. I addressed each of them by name, named their institutions, their published work, their specializations. Not as a performance of research, as a precise communication. I know exactly who you are and exactly what you have and have not done here. Then I thanked them, genuinely. They had not come in bad faith. They had come with the full extent of what they knew, and what they knew had not been sufficient, and that was a limitation, not a moral failing. What I held against them was the use of institutional authority to silence the person who had found what they missed. That I did not say aloud. I said, in the same even register, their collective contract was being ended effective immediately, fees paid in full, replacements being arranged. Then I looked at Rosa. I want your protocol implemented within the hour. You'll have everything you need. Whatever you ask for." The room produced outrage. The lead immunologist cited liability, standard of care, the regulatory framework. He was articulate and genuinely angry, and underneath the anger was the specific fear of a person watching a position they staked their credibility on be vacated without their permission. I listened to him completely. When he finished, I understand. Goodbye. The second specialist cited professional obligation. A third, the medical board. To each, in sequence, without variation. I understand. Goodbye. They left. Rosa did not celebrate. She nodded once and went to work. I became aware of Victor in the doorway. He was very still, not watching me the way he watched someone having an episode, waiting for it to resolve. Watching me the way he watched a variable that had permanently changed its value, recalculating everything. A changed Silas could not be leveraged by the things that had always leveraged him. For Victor, that was not a development. It was a threat. Some people protect power. Others protect innocence. The ones who protect innocence change everything. Victor pulled out his phone and made a call. "It's time," he said. "Do it tonight. Subscribe now. If you walked away from something powerful to protect something small, this channel was made for you." She began at 7 in the morning, and she did not stop. Rosa moved through the bay with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed every step in the hours before being permitted to take it. No theater. No ceremonial gravity. She simply worked. The first medication was reversed within the hour. The alternative introduced at the correct dosage, in the correct sequence. At the time, she had calculated from 6 days of observing Marco's metabolic response patterns. 8 hours after the protocol change, Marco's fever moved. Downward. Clinically, in isolation, it fell within the range of natural fluctuation. But Rosa had 6 days of context. She knew exactly what this movement meant. She wrote it down. At 16 hours, Marco's oxygen requirements decreased for the first time since his admission. The attending nurse called Rosa, who had briefly left to the staff room and returned still in her overnight scrubs 11 hours past the end of her shift. The nurses began to gather. Not formally. It happened the way things happen in hospitals, when something is occurring that the people who work there recognize as different from the ordinary texture of their days. They came quietly and watched the monitors the way people watch something they've been hoping to see and are afraid to believe they're actually seeing. Nobody called a specialist. Nobody called a press conference. At 24 hours, the infection markers began showing measurable improvement for the first time in 7 days. I want to say something about what the word unthinkable actually means in this story. The unthinkable thing Rosa did was not the diagnosis, the notebook, the walk across the corridor. Those things were remarkable, but they weren't the unthinkable thing. The unthinkable thing was that she stayed. 2 nurses before Rosa had raised concerns, smaller, less developed, but real. Both were quietly reassigned within 48 hours. Routine rotation adjustments, the kind that leaves no mark on a record and sends a message everyone receives and no one is required to acknowledge. Victor had contacted administration twice during those days. Both contacts produced formal conversations with Rosa, conducted in the language of professional concern, in which she was informed that pursuing findings outside her scope could constitute a violation of her licensure conditions. The second conversation included a folder placed on the table containing the paperwork for a formal complaint, left there for the duration of the meeting without being opened. Rosa had attended both meetings. She had returned to her shift after each one. She had nothing protecting her. No credentials, no connections, no powerful affiliation. She had only her certainty that she was right, and her commitment that Marco deserved someone who would not be moved by the things that had moved everyone else. 6 in the morning on the 8th day, she walked out of Marco's bay to where I was sitting. She stood in front of me. "He's fighting back." 4 words. No, however, no modulation of expectation. I said nothing. I put one hand flat against the glass. The stone architect stood there for a long time without moving, and something that had been bricked shut for 20 years came entirely and permanently loose in a way I did not try to stop. Marco was breathing better. Elena had been told the news and had cried for an hour. And somewhere across the city, Victor's plan was already in motion, because the one thing Victor had never accounted for was that saving the baby might make Silas completely impossible to reach. The complaint arrived at the hospital board's administrative office at 9 in the morning. The timing was deliberate, early enough to catch the board before the day's momentum made interruption difficult, late enough that Rosa had been in the building for over 24 hours and was running on obligation rather than rest. Victor had never done anything at 9 in the morning by coincidence. I was with Elena when it arrived. She had been strong enough to sit up. She was asking about Marco, and I was telling her the truth for the first time in 8 days without needing to manage it before delivering it. The fever was down. The infection markers were moving. The nurse who found the answer had worked through the night and stayed when she had every institutional reason not to. Elena listened with the expression she always wore when I told her things she had understood before I arrived at the telling. "A nurse," she said. "Yes." "Not one of the 20. "No." "Then, you believed her." It was not a question. I left her room, and my guard was waiting with the expression of a man delivering information he wishes he were not delivering. The complaint was connected, through 3 layers of legitimate business infrastructure belonging to the Kovak family, to a legal firm the hospital board had learned to treat with specific deference. It cited my documented criminal history, characterized my intervention as criminal interference in an established treatment protocol, demanded Rosa's immediate suspension. The board had agreed to move on it within the hour. Victor's goal was not to harm Marco. It was more precise, and in its way more devastating. He wanted to demonstrate that trusting Rosa could be made to cost more than not trusting her. He wanted Silas to watch sentiment lose. What he had not accounted for was the flaw in his own plan. Rosa's protocol was already working. Reversing it mid-treatment was not a political maneuver. It was medically dangerous, and the youngest resident on the floor understood this. He was 28 years old. He had been on the unit the entire admission, occupying the position of someone too junior to direct and too present to ignore, the person who sees everything and is consulted about nothing. He went to his workstation and began documenting Marco's current status, his trajectory, the specific clinical risks attached to interrupting the protocol now. He did this quietly, without announcing it, making the truth as legible and as difficult to misplace as possible. I found Victor near the elevator bank. He was not hiding. He met my eyes with the prepared expression of a man who believes the position he's taken is defensible. "You threatened a nurse," I said, very quietly. To make a point. To me, something moved across his face, not surprise, something older. The expression of a man who has spent 20 years building his identity around one relationship and has just heard it spoken about in the past tense by the only person whose past tense mattered. "Victor, we're done." The Syndicate had survived wars, raids, and rival families. It had never survived Silas Moran, deciding that something mattered more than the Empire. And tonight, everything did. I have spent 20 years learning how power actually flows, not the way it appears to flow, the subterranean channels through which consequence travels, the specific points in any system where precise pressure produces disproportionate results, not because the pressure is overwhelming, but because it is correctly placed. I had built an empire on this understanding. It had never occurred to me it could be used to build something else entirely. I called 3 board members directly. I did not threaten them. I informed them of the Kovak family's involvement, named the legal firm, the 3 layers of commercial infrastructure. Then I explained, with the patience of someone who understands how institutional liability attaches to individual decision-makers rather than to institutions in the abstract, what the personal consequences would be if a child's documented recovery was interrupted for political reasons, and that child's outcome changed. I did not tell them what to do. I simply ensured they could see, with complete clarity, what doing nothing would cost them. Then I called 2 city officials with regulatory authority over Kovak's legitimate business operations. Then a journalist, not famous, no large platform. What she had was a specific history of publishing accurate, sourced stories about the intersection of organized crime and legitimate business. Stories that had survived every legal challenge because they were correct. The Kovaks knew her name the way people know the names of things they had learned, through specific and costly experience to avoid. I didn't ask her to publish anything. I told her what was happening. I told her Rosa's suspension was connected to the Kovak family's legal infrastructure. She said she already found it interesting. The suspension order was withdrawn 40 minutes later. I arranged, through entirely legitimate channels, for Rosa's findings to be submitted to a peer-reviewed medical journal, formally written, properly sourced, attributed entirely to Rosa Delgado, night shift nurse, with her 6 days of documented observation as the evidentiary foundation, locked and submitted before the end of business in a way that created a public record that could not be reassigned or diluted. I did not tell her. I would tell her when it was done, because telling someone you are doing something before it is done makes the doing about yourself. Victor attempted to leave. My guards did not stop him. 3 of his own lieutenants were standing near the exit, men he had recruited, trained, managed. They were not armed in any visible way, not aggressive, simply standing with the configuration of people who had made a decision about where they were and were not prepared to move. Victor looked at them. They looked at Victor. He turned and sat in a chair near the window and remained there for 2 hours without speaking to anyone. Later that afternoon, Rosa found on the nursing station desk a formal letter of commendation signed by the chief of medicine, who had not written it willingly, but had written it correctly. Underneath it was a handwritten note. 3 words. Thank you. S. They moved her at noon, 20 meters in a wheelchair, from her room to the neonatal unit. Elena had both hands folded in her lap and was not speaking, unusual enough for Elena that I understood it immediately as the silence of someone reserving every available resource for what comes next. I walked beside her. I did not speak either. The nurse positioned the wheelchair beside the bassinet with the precision of someone who understands that the distance between a mother and her child, in this moment, should be exactly 0. Then she stepped back. Elena looked at Marco for a long moment before she touched him. 10 days of glass between them. 10 days of receiving him secondhand through monitor readings and nursing updates, and the managed information I had been translating from the full truth into the version her recovering body could absorb. She needed to see him with nothing between them before she believed the distance was actually closed. She reached in with her bruised, healing hand. The IV had left marks along the back of it, and touched Marco's face with the side of one finger. The lightest possible contact. Marco turned toward the touch. Instinctive. The movement of something that has not yet developed the capacity for intention, but has already developed the capacity for recognition. He turned with the blind, certain orientation of something that knows, beneath any level of consciousness, where it belongs. Elena made a sound I have no word for. It was not crying exactly, though tears came immediately and completely. It was something older than crying, something that had been compressed to a very dense point over 10 days, releasing all at once. She gathered Marco against her with the all-encompassing instinct of a mother, finally the only architecture her child requires. I stood in the doorway. Elena has always been right about doorways. It is a habit of mine. The place simultaneously inside and outside a room, present without being committed. But she looked up across the bassinet and the machines and the 10 days of everything this building had held, and she reached out her hand toward me. The gesture was so old, I felt it before I understood it. She had reached for my hand like that when we were children, in the dark. She had always been the one who reached. I had always been the one who took a moment too long to reach back. I walked into the room. She placed Marco in my arms. He was smaller than I had understood from the glass. He was the weight of something that had not yet fully committed to being in the world. He was warm. I counted the seconds without meaning to. It is what I do. I have always counted things. I counted to 43 before my composure failed. Not dramatically. I made no sound. I simply bowed my head over this small, warm, fighting person who had survived 20 doctors and his own compromised beginning and Victor's maneuvering and everything the last 10 days had required of him, and I let whatever had been held for 20 years come entirely and permanently loose. Elena put her hand on the back of my head. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Silas had spent 20 years being the most powerful man in every room he entered. Sitting beside his sister, holding a baby small enough to fit in one hand, he finally understood what it felt like to be in the right room. 3 months later, Marco was loud. He had arrived at 6 pounds and 1 ounce, silent and struggling, and had apparently decided he'd been quiet long enough. He announced his needs with the absolute confidence of someone who has learned, at a cellular level, that the world will respond. I found, to my own surprise, that I did not mind the noise. I minded very little about Sundays. Elena's building was different now. Same city, different neighborhood. Functioning locks, a street that was safer by the measures that matter. She hung curtains in yellow. I sat in her kitchen on Sundays and drank coffee that was too strong and watched Marco conduct his vigorous investigation of whatever surface he'd been placed on. And sometimes Elena and I talked, and sometimes we didn't, and both of those things were fine, in a way I had no adequate previous experience of. It was ordinary. I had not understood before that ordinary was something you could want. The clinic had opened 6 weeks ago, in the neighborhood where Rosa grew up, 8 blocks from the hospital where her mother had cleaned houses. Not large, not prestigious. Staffed on a single criterion: competence. Not connections. Not credentials from the right institutions. I had hired 3 nurses before opening day. Each passed over for advancement despite records that made the passing over indefensible on any grounds, other than the ones that had always governed these decisions. The clinic operated through a foundation with no connection to anything I had previously built. It was clean. Rosa had given me an education in what it cost to do good work inside a dirty structure. Rosa was in the certification program, Tuesdays and Thursdays, overnight on Fridays. She had already flagged 2 concerns in her current rotation that attending physicians initially dismissed and subsequently, upon review, incorporated. She had not contacted me. I had not expected her to. She still mopped floors when they needed mopping. Victor, I thought about less than I expected. He was not in prison. Pursuing that would have required me to remain connected to the machinery I was stepping away from. He was alive and free, and, from what reached me without my seeking it, simply no longer relevant. The Syndicate had not punished him. It had forgotten him. For Victor, that was worse. On the 3rd Sunday of the month, Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway with Marco against her shoulder. He did it again this morning, turned toward the door before you knocked. He knows your footsteps, or your voice from the stairs. Something I can't measure." She paused. "He knows you, see." Marco, as though aware he was under discussion, turned toward my stillness and regarded me with the wide, unguarded attention of someone who has not yet learned to manage what they feel before showing it. "Good," I said. The stone architect had spent 20 years building things that could be taken apart. He was only beginning to understand how to build something that couldn't be. The rooftop was mine, in the way that places become yours without transaction, through repeated presence, through the quality of quiet they offer. I had brought the sketchbook. I had kept one before the Syndicate, before the Empire. At 17, I was a person who drew things, not well, but consistently, with the absorption of someone who finds in rendering the visible world a quality of attention that other activities don't produce. I had stopped when the city made other demands on my hands. I had bought a new one 6 weeks ago. I drew the skyline first. The city from this height, the arrangement of buildings against fading light, the water visible between two older rooftops, like a line of silver held between dark hands. Then I drew the house. Small in the foreground. Simple lines, the kind that exists more as an idea of house than any specific architecture. A door, 2 windows, and in one window, in the lightest possible pressure of the pencil, the suggestion of light. Not a lamp, just the quality of a window, with something warm behind it, communicating without language. The single most important thing a window can communicate to someone standing in the dark. Someone is home. I thought about miracles. The miracle wasn't Marco's recovery. I understood this clearly now, on the rooftop, with the city going dark. Marco's recovery was the product of Rosa Delgado's specific, hard-won competence, applied with the specific, hard-won courage of someone who had spent her career learning that the truth was worth more than her comfort. It was explicable. It had a mechanism. The miracle was the sequence of choices that made it possible for Rosa to be in that bay, with that notebook, for 6 consecutive days. 20 doctors failed Marco because they each arrived with a conclusion they were testing and left when the evidence declined to confirm it. They saw a case. A case has a presenting problem and a protocol and an outcome. Rosa saw a child. A child has a specific, irreducible, non-transferable reality that requires someone to remain present long enough to understand what it actually needs. The difference between those 2 ways of seeing was the difference between everything and nothing. Victor tried to protect the Syndicate by making it harder, reinforcing every wall, ensuring nothing soft could find purchase in the machinery. He understood, correctly, that softness changes things. He understood, incorrectly, that change was the threat. The Syndicate he tried to preserve by expelling everything human from it was not worth preserving. Elena held on for 10 days, in part because she felt, beneath everything, the stillness she associated with me, the stillness of someone not going anywhere. She held on because she knew I was holding on. And I held on because, for the first time in 20 years, I had something worth holding on for. Something that weighed 6 pounds and 1 ounce and turned toward my voice in a kitchen before I'd even knocked. Something that knew me. I closed the sketchbook. I looked at the city I had helped build into what it was, that had made me, and that I had marked in ways I was not naive about and could not undo. Still beautiful from this height, still complicated from every other height, both true simultaneously, quietly, to no one. 20 doctors couldn't do it. A woman with second-hand scrubs and a notebook did. A pause. Figure out what that means, and you'll know everything worth knowing. Sometimes the strongest men aren't the ones who command fear. but the ones who finally learn how to trust the people the world forgot to look at. The stone architect didn't fall. He was rebuilt, not by power, not by money, but by a nurse who stayed when everyone else found reasons to walk away, by a baby too small to know he was saving anyone, by a sister who reached out her hand and waited, the way she had always waited, for her brother to remember that reaching back was something he was still capable of. Subscribe and comment. Who in your life saw something everyone else missed? Who stayed when the easier thing was to leave? The world is full of roses. Tell us yours below. Thank you for watching. If this story reached something in you, like subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. More stories from the place where the underworld meets the unbreakable human heart, every week.